The winter wind carried death across the Wyoming highlands, cold, merciless, unforgiving. Three riders crested the ridge, silhouetted against the steel-gray sky. Their breath hung in the frigid air as their mounts picked a careful path down the snow-covered slope. They moved with purpose, eyes fixed on the lone set of tracks cutting through the pristine white below. "He can't have gotten far," growled Jackson Wild, a tall man with a face scarred by violence and time. "Not with that wound." Blood dotted the snow like crimson stars against a white heaven. Fresh, recent, leading to a stand of pines that offered the only cover in this desolate expanse. The riders spread out, Winchester rifles held ready. The hunt was reaching its end. A flash erupted from within the pines. Thunder split the silence. The leftmost rider jerked violently, tumbling from his saddle into the crimson-speckled snow. "Scatter!" Wild shouted, but the second rider had already caught a bullet. His horse reared as he clutched his chest, face frozen in permanent surprise. Wild spurred his mount, zigzagging across the open ground. Another shot cracked the air. His shoulder erupted in pain as the bullet tore through flesh. He kept riding, cursing through gritted teeth. Behind him, Ethan Blackwood emerged from the pines like a specter, a former captain in the Confederate Army, now a ghost haunting the frontier. 6'2", broad-shouldered, with eyes cold as the winter around him. Blood soaked his left sleeve where a bullet had found its mark earlier that day. He raised his Colt single-action army, the Peacemaker, and took careful aim at Wild's retreating form. His finger tightened on the trigger, then relaxed. Too far now. Let the bastard ride. Their paths would cross again. Men like Wild always circled back, like vultures to carrion. Ethan holstered his weapon and gathered the dead men's horses. No sense wasting good mounts in this wilderness. He lashed them to his own and resumed his journey homeward, each hoof beat marking the rhythm of survival in this harsh land. The cabin stood alone in a small clearing, built with the precision of a man who understood that imperfection meant death in these mountains. Logs fitted tight against the Wyoming winter, chimney drawing true, windows small to preserve heat. Ethan had constructed it 3 years ago, after the war, after the nightmares began. After he'd decided that solitude was preferable to the company of men who couldn't understand what he'd seen. He stabled the horses, unloaded his gear, and finally allowed himself to tend properly to his wound. The bullet had passed clean through muscle, missing bone and artery. Luck, or perhaps skill on his part, knowing how to move when lead flew. He washed the wound with whiskey, gritting his teeth against the burn, then packed it with crushed yarrow leaves before bandaging it tight. Inside the cabin, Ethan stoked the banked fire in the stone hearth. Warmth gradually reclaimed the space as he hung his bloodied shirt to dry. The walls were lined with the tools of survival: 2 rifles on wooden pegs, ammunition stored in wooden crates, dried meat hanging from rafters, shelves of canned goods and supplies. A warrior's refuge. The wound throbbed as he poured 3 fingers of whiskey into a tin cup. He drank it neat, savoring the burn. It had been 5 years since Appomattox, since the surrender, since he'd walked away from the ruins of a cause he'd never fully embraced, but had fought for out of duty and kinship. Now he had new enemies, men who hunted him for bounties both real and imagined. Men who couldn't leave the past buried beneath the blood-soaked soil of a divided nation. Dawn broke harsh and clear across the frozen landscape. Ethan checked his traps, collected wood for the stove, and tended his wound, the daily ritual of a man whose only purpose was continued existence. The bullet graze was healing clean. No infection, small mercies. He was returning from the creek, fresh water sloshing in wooden buckets, when he spotted them. Tracks. Not deer or elk or wolf. Something dragged through the snow, creating an uneven furrow alongside smaller impressions. hands or knees pulling a body forward. Ethan set down his buckets, drew his Colt, and followed the trail with the caution of a man who'd survived a war by anticipating ambush. The tracks led toward a stand of aspens where something dark lay collapsed against the pristine white. A body, small, motionless except for the faintest rise and fall of labored breathing. A woman, young, Apache by her features and the intricate beadwork on her tattered clothing. Her long black hair was frozen in matted strands. Her skin bore the gray pallor of extreme cold. Ethan knelt beside her, gun still ready, scanning the area for signs of others. Finding none, he examined her more closely. The discovery stole his breath like a physical blow. Both her legs ended above the knee, the stumps wrapped in crude bandages now frozen, stiff with blood. Old wounds, healing but strained from her desperate journey through the snow. He recognized the handiwork, field amputations to stop the spread of infection or gangrene. He'd seen enough during the war to know them well, a battlefield surgeon's mercy that saved lives while forever altering them. The woman's eyes fluttered open, dark, unfocused with cold and exhaustion. Recognition dawned in them, followed by something like terror. "She do. Hug handy," she whispered through cracked lips. Ethan didn't understand her words, but the fear in her eyes told him enough. She recognized him, or thought she did. "Easy," he said, holstering his weapon. "You need shelter or you'll die out here." She tried to push away from him, her movements weak but desperate. "Mayeb, Tseni, Yikai," she gasped. "White Wolf," she managed in broken English. "Deathbringer." The name struck Ethan like a physical blow. It was what the Apache had called him during the campaigns, when he led scout parties tracking their bands, when he'd been a different man serving a different purpose. Her eyes rolled back as consciousness fled. Ethan made his decision in the cold calculus of the frontier. Leave her and she would die. Take her and he invited complications he'd spent years avoiding. He gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body alternately stiff and trembling with cold. As he carried her back to his cabin, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. A burden he'd thought he'd left behind with his captain's bars and the oaths of a war now lost. The woman, who he would later learn was named Sarah, daughter of the great chief Red Cloud himself, had been left to die by her own people after losing her legs in a cavalry raid. The same raid that had killed her mother and two brothers. The raid led by Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sherman of the 7th Cavalry, a man with a particular hatred for the Apache and a reputation for brutality that exceeded even the harsh standards of frontier warfare. Ethan laid her on his cot by the fire, removed her frozen outer garments, and covered her with every blanket he possessed. He melted snow in a kettle, added herbs known to fight cold sickness, and set about examining her wounded legs more carefully. The amputations had been performed months ago. The cuts were healing, but the strain of her journey had reopened some areas. He cleaned them carefully, applied a poultice of yarrow and sage, and wrapped them in fresh bandages. Throughout his ministrations, she remained unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Ethan kept the fire well fed through the night, dozing in his chair, one hand always near his peacemaker. Old habits. When dawn's weak light filtered through the frost-covered windows, he checked her again. Her color had improved, her breathing stronger. She would live, at least for now. The real question was what happened next. Sarah woke with the sudden alertness of a hunted creature. Her hand shot beneath her clothing, emerging with a small bone-handled knife. Ethan, who had been expecting something like this, caught her wrist before she could strike. They locked eyes across the space between predator and prey, though which remained uncertain. "If I wanted you dead," he said evenly, "you'd have frozen in the snow." Her dark eyes flickered with calculation, then something like resignation. She lowered the knife. "You are Maya Tseni," she said, her English halting but clear. "The White Wolf. You killed many Apache." "That was during war," Ethan replied, releasing her wrist. "I've buried those days." "War never ends for my people," she said bitterly. "Only changes shape." Ethan couldn't argue with that truth. He offered her water, which she accepted cautiously, never taking her eyes off him. "Your legs," he said. "How long?" "3 moons," she answered. "Cavalry attacked our camp. I was shot. The wounds festered. Our medicine man cut to save my life. And your people left you behind." Her expression hardened. "I slowed them. Winter comes. Weak die, so strong survive." The brutal logic of survival. Ethan understood it better than most. "You're safe here," he said, though he wondered if the words were true for either of them. "For now," she replied, and in those 2 words lay all the uncertainty of their shared future. The days assumed a tentative rhythm. Ethan constructed wooden handrails throughout the cabin, giving Sarah means to pull herself from bed to table to door. She accepted his help with stoic dignity, never complaining, never expressing gratitude. They existed in parallel, 2 survivors bound by circumstance rather than choice. On the 5th day, a rider approached the cabin. Ethan spotted him from the window. Marcus Reeves, a trader who occasionally brought supplies and news from the nearest settlement 30 miles distant. "Stay quiet," Ethan told Sarah, helping her move to the small back room. "Not everyone would understand your presence here." She nodded, understanding the danger instantly. Frontier hospitality had its limits, especially when it came to Apache. Reeves stomped snow from his boots before entering. A big man with a perpetually ruddy face, he carried the gossip of 3 counties along with his trade goods. "Blackwood," he greeted, setting a small crate on the table. "Coffee, ammunition, and that tobacco you favor. Price has gone up since the snows." They haggled briefly before settling on 2 deer hides and a bag of coffee beans as payment. Business concluded, Reeves warmed himself by the fire, eyes wandering the cabin's interior. "Heard about your trouble," he said casually, too casually. "3 men dead on the North Ridge. Bounty hunters, they say." Ethan's expression remained neutral. "Man has a right to defend himself." "Course he does," Reeves agreed. "Just like a man has a right to wonder why those particular men were hunting these particular hills." Ethan said nothing, but his hand drifted closer to his holstered Colt. "Word is," Reeves continued, "Sherman's got a new mission. Pacification, he calls it, clearing every Apache from the territory by whatever means necessary." "Sherman always was ambitious," Ethan remarked dryly. "He's got backing this time. Government wants this land clear for the railroad. Settlers, too. Hired men like Jackson Wild to supplement the cavalry. Men who don't ask questions about orders." Ethan felt a cold knot form in his gut. Wild's working with Sherman now? Leading his scout parties? Man knows how to track, they say. Reeves paused, his gaze sharpening. "Strange thing happened at the trading post yesterday. Wild came in, shoulder all bandaged up, asking if anyone had seen you recently." The silence that followed carried weight. Reeves fidgeted, then stood abruptly. "Well, I should get moving before the light goes." As he reached for his coat, a small sound came from the back room. A shift of weight, the creak of floorboards. Reeves froze, head cocked like a predator sensing prey. "You got company, Blackwood." "Just some supplies stored back there," Ethan said evenly. "Attracts mice this time of year." Reeves's expression darkened with suspicion. "Funny. Doesn't sound like mice to me." He moved toward the back room. Ethan stepped into his path, one hand resting openly on his Colt now. "That's far enough, Marcus." Reeves stopped, his own hand drifting toward the knife at his belt. What are you hiding, Blackwood? Nothing that concerns you. See, that's where you're wrong. Reeves's voice hardened. Sherman's offering gold for information, especially about Apache survivors or those helping them. Understanding crystallized between them. Reeves knew, or suspected enough to be dangerous. I always took you for a man of honor, Marcus, Ethan said quietly. Honor don't keep a man warm or fed, Reeves replied. Now step aside. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Reeves lunged, not for the room, but for Ethan, knife flashing in the firelight. Ethan drew and fired in one fluid motion. The Colt's report was deafening in the confined space. Reeves staggered back, a look of surprise spreading across his face, along with the crimson stain blooming on his chest. You shot me, he said, as if the concept were difficult to grasp. You didn't leave me much choice, Ethan replied, watching as the traitor crumpled to the floor. Reeves gasped once, twice, then lay still. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the lingering echo of the gunshot. Sarah appeared in the doorway of the back room, pulling herself along the wall. She looked at Reeves' body without surprise or remorse. Now they will come, she said simply. Ethan nodded. Yes, now they will come. He buried Reeves behind the cabin, digging through frozen ground in the fading light. The traitor's horse he set loose, knowing it would eventually find its way to familiar territory. Let them wonder what had happened. Let them come searching, better than waiting for the inevitable. That night, as snow began to fall again, Ethan began teaching Sarah how to defend herself. He showed her how to load and fire his spare Remington revolver, how to use the terrain of the cabin to her advantage despite her limited mobility. You move quietly, he observed as she practiced pulling herself from one position to another. Good instincts. I hunted before, she said. Different now, but same skill. He fashioned a system of ropes and pulleys that would allow her to move quickly between defensive positions. Then he taught her the weak points of a man. Throat, eyes, groin, places where even her small knife could prove lethal. Why help me fight? She asked during a rest. Could leave me. Save yourself. Ethan considered the question, surprised to find he didn't have a ready answer. I've left too many behind already, he finally said. Made too many compromises. The White Wolf has conscience, she said, not unkindly. The White Wolf is dead, Ethan replied. Died at Appomattox with the cause. Sarah studied him with ancient eyes and a young face. No, he sleeps, but he will wake again when needed. 3 days passed in tense preparation. Ethan reinforced the cabin's defenses, set traps around the perimeter, and established escape routes should they become necessary. Sarah continued to grow stronger, her movements more confident as she adapted to her new limitations. On the 4th day they came. Jackson Wilde led a party of 5 men to the edge of the clearing. They made no attempt at stealth, confident in their numbers and purpose. Blackwood, Wilde shouted. We know you're in there. Send out the Apache woman and we'll let you walk away. Ethan positioned himself by a window, rifle ready. Sarah took her place near another, the Remington steady in her hand. Reeves isn't coming back, Wilde, Ethan called. Neither is anyone who steps into this clearing with bad intentions. Wilde laughed, an ugly sound. You're outnumbered, Captain. This doesn't have to end with your death. Doesn't have to end with yours either, Ethan replied. But it will if you don't ride away now. Instead of answering, Wilde signaled his men. They spread out, seeking cover at the clearing's edge. The standoff had begun. The first shot came from Wilde's Winchester, shattering a window and embedding itself in the cabin wall. Ethan returned fire, forcing the men to keep their distance. For several minutes, bullets flew between the cabin and the tree line, neither side gaining advantage. Then smoke began to rise from the side of the cabin. One of Wilde's men had circled around, using the gunfire as cover to fling a torch onto the roof. Fire, Sarah warned, though Ethan had already smelled the burning wood. Stay here, he ordered. Keep them pinned down. He grabbed a bucket of water and climbed the ladder to the loft, pushing open the small roof hatch. As he emerged, a bullet splintered wood inches from his head. He ducked, then rose again, throwing the water onto the flames. Another shot, closer this time. Ethan dropped back through the hatch as bullets tore through the space he'd occupied seconds before. The fire smoldered but didn't die. Smoke began filling the cabin. We need to move, Ethan decided. There's a root cellar beneath the floorboards. Tunnel leads out behind the woodshed. He helped Sarah down into the dark space, handed her the Remington, then went back for his rifle and ammunition. The smoke was thickening, making it difficult to breathe. A crash from the front announced that Wiles' men had breached the door. Ethan fired twice, heard a scream of pain, then dropped through the trap door, pulling it closed above him. In the darkness of the tunnel, he found Sarah waiting. Together they moved toward the exit, crawling through the narrow space as gunfire and shouts echoed above them. They emerged behind the woodshed, the winter air sharp in their lungs after the smoke. Ethan peered around the corner. The men were focused on the cabin, believing their quarry trapped inside the burning structure. "The horses," he whispered. "Stay low." He lifted Sarah onto his back, her arms wrapped around his neck, and moved from shadow to shadow toward the small stable. They had almost reached it when a shout went up. "There, behind the shed!" Ethan dove for cover as bullets kicked up snow around them. He returned fire, dropping one of Wiles' men, then pushed Sarah toward the stable door. "Get inside," he urged. "I'll hold them off." "No," she said firmly. "Together or not at all." Before he could argue, the world exploded in noise and confusion. Riders burst from the tree line, a dozen Apache warriors on painted ponies, war cries piercing the winter air as they descended upon Wiles' men with devastating fury. Leading them was a warrior whose presence seemed to radiate authority and power. He rode directly for Wiles, who turned to flee but was cut down by a precisely thrown tomahawk. The remaining bounty hunters scattered, only to be hunted down one by the Apache riders. As quickly as it had begun, the skirmish ended. Bodies lay scattered across the blood-speckled snow. The warrior leader dismounted and approached where Ethan and Sarah had taken cover. "Brother," Sarah called in Apache, her voice thick with emotion. The warrior, Running Wolf, Sarah's brother, believed dead in the cavalry raid, embraced his sister, then turned his gaze to Ethan. "You protected my sister," he said in halting English. "Why?" Ethan considered his answer carefully. "Because it was right," he said simply. "Because I've spent too long doing what was wrong." Running Wolf studied him with the same penetrating gaze as his sister. Then he nodded once. A gesture of profound respect between warriors. "The white wolf has changed his coat," he said, "but not lost his fangs." The Apache warriors helped extinguish the cabin fire, which had damaged only a portion of the roof. As they worked, Running Wolf explained how he had survived the cavalry attack, gathered survivors, and been searching for his sister since learning she had been abandoned. "Our people believed you dead," he told Sarah. "I never accepted it." "And now?" she asked. Running Wolf's expression darkened. "Now we prepare. Sherman gathers soldiers at Fort Laramie. He plans to hunt down every Apache within 100 miles. Not just the Apache," Ethan added. "Anyone who stands with them." The implication hung in the air between them. By helping Sarah, Ethan had chosen a side in a conflict he'd spent years avoiding. That evening, as the warriors camped nearby, Ethan and Sarah sat by the repaired cabin's fire. The events of the day had shifted something between them, creating a bond forged in shared danger and survival. "You should go with your brother," Ethan said. "He can protect you better than I can." Sarah shook her head. "My place is here now." "Why?" Ethan asked. "Your people need every warrior." "I am no warrior," she said, gesturing to her missing legs. "Not as I was." "You fought today," Ethan pointed out. "Courage isn't measured in limbs." She smiled faintly. Then perhaps that is why I stay. Because you see me as I am, not as what I have lost. The simple truth of her words struck deeper than Ethan expected. He too had been seen for what he was. Not the decorated Confederate officer, not the feared scout known as White Wolf, but simply a man trying to find redemption in a harsh land. Dawn broke clear and cold. Running Wolf's scouts reported cavalry movements to the east. Sherman's men approaching fast. The lieutenant colonel himself rode with them, determined to make an example of the renegade Apache band and the white traitor who harbored them. We are outnumbered, Running Wolf acknowledged, but we choose the battlefield. Ethan studied the terrain surrounding the cabin. The North Ridge, he suggested. High ground, good cover. We can funnel them through the pass. Running Wolf nodded. A good death trap, but some must remain to spring it. I'll stay, Ethan volunteered. It's me Sherman wants most of all. Then I stay also, Sarah insisted. Running Wolf began to protest, but Sarah silenced him with a look that transcended her years and injuries. I cannot ride or run, she said, but I can fight. Let me choose my battlefield. The plan took shape quickly. Running Wolf and his warriors would position themselves above the ridge pass. Ethan and Sarah would remain at the cabin as bait, retreating to the pass only when Sherman's force was fully committed to the pursuit. As the Apache prepared to depart, Running Wolf approached Ethan with a bundle wrapped in soft leather. My father's rifle, he said, unwrapping an old but well-maintained Sharps buffalo gun. It speaks with thunder and reaches far. Ethan accepted the weapon with the reverence it deserved. I'll use it well. I know, Running Wolf replied. The White Wolf has found his true pack at last. They rode out, leaving Ethan and Sarah to make their final preparations. He helped her establish a firing position near the cabin's rear window, then set up his own at the front. The Sharps he placed within easy reach, loaded and ready. Tell me about Sherman, Sarah said as they waited. What kind of man is he? Ethan's expression hardened. The kind who believes the only good Indian is a dead one. The kind who ordered women and children shot at Sand Creek and called it victory. And you followed such orders? Her question held no judgment, only curiosity. No, Ethan said quietly. That's why I left. Why there's a price on my head, too. Sarah nodded, understanding now the full measure of the man who had saved her. Then we fight not just for survival, but for justice. Justice is a luxury out here, Ethan replied. I'll settle for keeping you alive. The sun climbed higher. The air warmed just enough to soften the snow, making tracking easier. Perfect conditions for what was to come. They heard the cavalry before they saw them. The jingle of tack, the snort of horses, the low murmur of men who believed victory was at hand. Then they appeared at the edge of the clearing, 24 soldiers in blue coats led by a figure Ethan recognized instantly. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sherman sat tall in the saddle, his gray mustache and cold eyes exactly as Ethan remembered from their last encounter 5 years earlier. The man who had given orders Ethan couldn't follow. The man whose brutality had driven Ethan from the army and into the solitude of the frontier. Blackwood, Sherman called. I know you're in there. Surrender now and I'll make your hanging quick. Ethan remained silent, watching through a narrow gap in the shutters. Let Sherman come closer. Let him commit his men. You always were soft on these savages, Sherman continued, but harboring enemies of the United States? That's treason, Captain, and we both know the penalty for that. Still Ethan waited, finger resting lightly on the trigger of his Winchester. Sarah remained equally still at her post, the discipline of a born hunter evident in her patience. Sherman signaled his men forward. They advanced cautiously, rifles ready, spreading out to surround the cabin. When they were halfway across the clearing, Ethan fired. His shot struck the soldier nearest Sherman, toppling him from his horse. The cavalry scattered for cover as Ethan continued firing, methodically working the Winchester's lever action. 3 more soldiers fell before they managed to establish a firing line at the edge of the clearing. Bullets tore through the cabin walls. Ethan moved from window to window, firing, retreating, changing position to create the impression of multiple defenders. Sarah added her fire from the rear, picking off soldiers who tried to circle behind. For 20 minutes, the exchange continued. Then Sherman ordered his men to prepare torches. They would burn out the defenders as Wild had attempted. "Time to move," Ethan told Sarah. He helped her onto his back, grabbed the Sharp's rifle, and slipped through the rear door during a lull in the firing. They made their way toward the north ridge, using the trees for cover. Behind them, flames began to consume the cabin for the second time in 2 days. "They're following," Sarah warned, looking back over Ethan's shoulder. Sherman had spotted their escape. He led a group of riders in pursuit while the rest of his men secured the burning cabin. Ethan pushed harder, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he carried Sarah up the increasingly steep terrain. The pass loomed ahead, a narrow gap between towering rock walls. Once through it, they would spring the trap. A bullet kicked up snow beside them, then another closer. Sherman's men were gaining. "Put me down," Sarah ordered. "Behind those rocks. I'll hold them while you reach the pass." "Not leaving you," Ethan grunted, continuing forward. "Fool," she said, but her tone carried something like affection. "We both die if we're too slow." She was right. Ethan found cover behind a large boulder, settled Sarah with the Remington, and took up the Sharps. "Count to 100, he told her. "Then follow as best you can." He didn't wait for her agreement. Emerging from cover, he fired the Sharps. The heavy rifle roared, sending a .52 caliber bullet through the chest of the lead rider. The man toppled, causing those behind to swerve and break formation. Ethan continued up the slope, drawing their attention. Sarah added her fire, picking off another cavalryman who strayed too close to their position. Sherman bellowed orders, sending men to flank the ridge on both sides. It was exactly what Running Wolf had anticipated. The soldiers rode into carefully laid ambush positions where Apache warriors waited with bows, rifles, and tomahawks. Screams erupted from the flanks as the trap was sprung. Sherman, suddenly realizing his danger, ordered a retreat. Too late. Apache riders appeared behind him, cutting off his escape. Ethan reached the pass entrance. He turned to see Sarah dragging herself up the slope, determination etched on every feature. Below her, Sherman had broken free of the closing trap with 3 soldiers. They were riding hard toward her exposed position. Without hesitation, Ethan raised the Sharps again. Distance, 400 yards. Wind, slight from the west. He adjusted his aim, breathed out, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet caught Sherman in the shoulder, spinning him in the saddle. The lieutenant colonel kept his seat but reeled from the impact. His men hesitated, looking to their leader for direction. It was all the time Running Wolf needed. His warriors descended on the small group like wolves on wounded prey. Sherman alone escaped their initial charge, spurring his horse toward the ridge where Sarah continued her painful ascent. Vengeance drove him now. If he could not win, he would at least claim one last Apache life before the end. Ethan worked the Sharp's action, ejecting the spent cartridge, but he knew he wouldn't reload in time. Sherman was closing on Sarah, saber drawn, face contorted with hatred. Then Sarah turned, the Remington steady in her hand. She fired once, twice, 3 times. Sherman jerked with each impact but kept coming, his horse eating the distance between them. Ethan abandoned the Sharps and ran back down the slope, drawing his Colt. Too far. He wouldn't reach her in time. Sarah fired her last 2 rounds. The 5th shot struck Sherman's horse in the head, dropping it instantly. The lieutenant colonel was thrown clear. Landing in the snow 10 feet from where Sarah waited, her empty revolver now useless. Sherman rose unsteadily, blood staining his uniform from multiple wounds, none immediately fatal. He advanced on Sarah, saber raised for a killing stroke. She did not cower or plead. She faced him with the dignity of a warrior, knife drawn, prepared to sell her life dearly. The saber began its downward arc. A shot rang out. Sherman stiffened, a look of surprise crossing his features. He turned slowly to face Ethan, who stood 30 yards away, Colt smoking in his outstretched hand. "You?" Sherman began, but never finished. He collapsed face first into the blood-stained snow, the saber falling from lifeless fingers. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entirety of the Wyoming Territory. Then it was broken by the approach of Running Wolf and his warriors, who had dispatched the last of Sherman's men. Ethan hurried to Sarah's side, checking her for injuries. She looked up at him, eyes bright with the fierce joy of survival. "We live," she said simply. "We live," he agreed, helping her to her feet, or what remained of them. He supported her weight easily, naturally, as if they had been partners for years rather than days. Running Wolf surveyed the battlefield with the practiced eye of a leader counting costs and victories. "Sherman's death will bring more soldiers," he warned. "Or perhaps less," Ethan countered. "Without his hatred driving them, the army might be content to claim this land gradually rather than through blood." "What will you do now, brother?" Running Wolf asked Sarah. She looked at Ethan, then back to her bloodkin. "I stay," she said firmly. "This is my place now." Running Wolf nodded, unsurprised. "And you, White Wolf, will you rebuild your den?" Ethan surveyed the ridge, the pass, the distant smoke from his burning cabin. He thought of the years spent in isolation, running from his past, hiding from his nature. Then he looked at Sarah, who had lost everything yet refused to surrender to despair. "Yeah," he said, "but not alone this time." In the days that followed, they began rebuilding. The Apache warriors helped raise a new cabin, larger and better situated for defense. Ethan constructed special accommodations for Sarah, rails, ramps, tools adapted to her needs. She, in turn, taught him the ways of her people, how to move silently through forest, how to read the language of birds and animals, how to exist in harmony with the land rather than in constant battle against it. Word spread of Sherman's defeat. Some called it a massacre, others justice long delayed. The army sent investigators who, finding no survivors from Sherman's command, could only report that the lieutenant colonel had exceeded his orders and paid the price for his recklessness. Wild's men were never officially accounted for. They became another mystery of the frontier, their fate known only to those who had witnessed their final moments. Spring came to the highlands, melting snow and bringing new growth to the scarred land. Ethan stood on the porch of the new cabin, watching Sarah as she expertly cleaned a deer hide. She moved with confidence now, having mastered her new reality through sheer force of will. "Rider coming," she announced without looking up from her work. Her hearing remained sharper than his, one of many gifts she brought to their partnership. Ethan stepped inside for his rifle, then returned to stand ready but not threatening. The approaching horseman proved to be a young army lieutenant, riding alone, a sign of either confidence or foolishness. "Captain Blackwood?" the officer called, reining in at a respectful distance. "Haven't been a captain for a long time," Ethan replied. "State your business." The lieutenant dismounted carefully. "I bring a message from Colonel Harrington at Fort Laramie. The investigation into Lieutenant Colonel Sherman's actions has been concluded." "And?" Ethan prompted when the young man hesitated. "And it has been determined that Sherman acted without proper authority in pursuing hostile actions against peaceful settlements. His death is therefore considered a consequence of his own insubordination." Translation: the army had decided to disavow Sherman rather than risk further conflict, a political decision rather than a moral one, but the result was the same. "Is that all?" Ethan asked. The lieutenant shifted uncomfortably. "Colonel Harrington also wished me to convey that Certain warrants have been rescinded. Your record has been adjusted, meaning his past had been officially forgotten. Convenient for everyone concerned. Tell your colonel I appreciate the gesture, Ethan said. Now, unless you have further business, I suggest you start back before dark. These mountains can be dangerous for men who don't know them. The lieutenant nodded, remounted, and departed without further comment. Ethan watched until he disappeared from view, then turned to find Sarah regarding him thoughtfully. They fear you still, she observed. The white wolf's shadow is long. Let them fear, Ethan replied. Fear keeps men honest sometimes. And what of us? She asked. What keeps us honest? Ethan considered the question, looking out over the land that had become theirs, not through conquest or decree, but through blood and choice and shared purpose. Each other, he said finally, we keep each other honest. Sarah nodded, accepting the simple truth. She returned to her work and Ethan to his, the rhythm of their lives now irrevocably intertwined. Two souls who had lost everything yet found something neither expected, not just survival, but purpose, not just existence, but life. The white wolf had found his true pack at last,